Hey again. Alright, this is what you've been waiting like 3 months for. Magic as a force of nature. Not in the metaphorical sense, but the quite literal sense among the 4 forces of nature. Or 6 forces of nature in fiction. I'll cover psionics next time, but for now, magic. So, why am I calling magic a force of nature? Well, if you're going to build a world from scratch, you have to understand how stuff works, so that you avoid plot holes and inconsistencies. It doesn't have to be super ultra rigorous or anything, just internally consistent. For me, that means viewing everything from a scientific perspective. When it comes to magic, that means I consider how it does and what it does, and that involves much of the same stuff we already know about physics, but skewed to work a little bit differently. This means that magic has a carrier particle, known as mana. It can be called all sorts of things, from Xeon to etheric energy to whatever else you can think of, but it's basically mana. Without this mana, there is no magic, kind of like photons or electrons. You don't have either of those, you don't have electromagnetics. Now, this isn't just me making stuff up. Well, it is, but it isn't. See, this is more of a description of how magic is already used in fiction to begin with. For example, mana flows in a very predictable manner similar to electrons. A path of least resistance. We see this all the time, with the most obvious example being ley lines, which may as well be conductive metal. Other examples are things like wands or staves, again, basically the same concept as holding an iron bar in a thunderstorm. I don't suggest holding the iron bar in a thunderstorm, just saying. So, before we go any further, what makes magic work? 4 main things, really. First off, you need an energy source. Magic doesn't just magically happen, as much as that would make sense. No, it still follows the conservation of energy principle, in which energy can neither be created nor destroyed, merely reconfigured to another form of energy or matter. We see this all the time in games, actually. It just doesn't seem obvious at first. The concept of mana, or anything similar at all, in fact implies this conservation of energy. You don't consume the mana so that it disappears, you just change it into another form. The mana was already present as a super naturally occurring form of energy to begin with. The importance of this is that there must always be an energy source somewhere. Maybe you draw upon the spirit world, or the warp from Warhammer 40k, or the life stream from Final Fantasy VII, or some other variant upon such. It doesn't really matter the form it takes, just that there's always something which supplies the energy to begin with. It's just waiting there to be tapped. The second part of magic is a focusing agent. This may be anything from a unicorn's horn in My Little Pony, or a wizard's wand in Harry Potter, or the gloves worn by the Kabbalists in Hellgate, for a few examples. The stereotypical wizard staff, since at least The Lord of the Rings, is the same concept as well here. It doesn't matter if you have a ton of mana just floating around you as an ambient source. You still need to have some way to focus all that energy into a single spot so that it can be turned into something actually useful. In many cases, this takes the form of the caster's own body. In games and novels where only some people have the talent for magic, Basically what they're describing is the body having a low resistance to mana, similar to how some few people have a naturally low electrical resistance, allowing for them to conduct electrical currents at an amazingly efficient rate. What this means is that energy can flow through the caster like a lightning rod, drawing magical energy to them to be used. A walking battery of sorts. This takes on a lot of different incarnations across various movies, books, and games, as well as even mythology and actual religions in reality, but all boils down to the same concept. You need an energy source, and a way to bring that energy together before it can be properly utilized. Now, that brings us to what we colloquially call magic itself, the spell. The spell is essentially a computer program, for lack of a better term. The spell tells the energy you've gathered what to do, how to do it, and the specific details about exactly what's being done. Even a fairly simple spell has an enormous amount of context which is needed to be able to get it to do what you want. Consider the basic idea of create water as a spell for a moment here. Alright, so you convert magical energy into matter, specifically water. Yay! That was easy. Wait, but you need to tell it what water is. 2 hydrogen atoms spread at 120 degrees apart, attached to an oxygen atom. And what atoms even are. More than that, you also need to specify where that water will appear. Want to create water inside someone's stomach? Oh. That's, that takes some finicky calculations, doesn't it? What defines stomach in this case? You need some way to specify exactly where the water is going, or it might just be plopped into someone's bloodstream, which could very well kill them. You also need to specify that the water doesn't just replace tissue, which is already present, lest you accidentally bisect someone. That would be kind of messy. At least you'd have lots of water to clean it up on hand, so that's good, I guess? Anyway, the point is that the spell itself tells the energy what to do. This can take the form of ritual summoning circles, hand waves, chanting, all sorts of things. One of the novels from Shadowrun explained it in a very eloquent manner, I found. The act of drawing the summoning circle isn't the spell itself. It's merely the organization of your thoughts in a particular manner. That's why you can't just draw it out on a sheet of paper and dump it on the ground. The circle itself doesn't mean anything. Rather, it's a step-by-step checklist of how to tell the man what to do. It doesn't really matter if you actually draw out the summoning circle with chalk or not, to be perfectly blunt. What matters is that you go through the mental motions of basically printing off a circuit board for the energy to travel upon so it knows what it's supposed to do. The same concept can be applied to virtually every form of magic ever imagined. Shamanism, where you get your dead ancestors or some spirits of the wild to do stuff for you. You still have to tell them what to do, and they still are the ones to actually cast the spell. And it still requires input to know what to do. What about using spell reagents in D&D? Yep, still use a shorthand method of telling the energy what you're trying to accomplish. Even like rune magic, where you draw out the runes and then they trigger. Yeah, same thing. So that's 3 out of 4, but what's the last bit? You already have a spell. That's the end of it, right? Well, no. Last part is your triggering mechanism. A lot of the time this is built into the end of a spell. If the spell itself is a program, and the triggering mechanism is when you compile your spell's code and actually run the executable. This isn't always built into the spell itself, though. Any sort of delayed spell, trap, runes, or warding spells all have a separate trigger. Consider it like a safety match. Your standard strike anywhere match in old cartoons had both the ignition source and the fuel together. You could just strike it anywhere and poof, done. That was also dangerous as hell. Today, virtually all matches come in 3 parts. The fuel is the wooden matchstick itself, but the igniter is in 2 separate stages. The tip has half of it, the box has the other half. It's only when you put the 2 ignition halves together that you actually get the fire started, which is an awful lot safer to use. As such, you may see this kind of a thing show up in games or novels from time to time. Saorsa itself actually has a 2-stage casting sequence for its spells, where you build the spell's program into a spell lattice, then you collapse the lattice as a separate action into the actual spell for use, triggering it to actually perform the spell's actions, meaning you can create a spell long in advance and hold on to it, ready to release the moment it's needed at a fraction of the normal cost. Other than the fact that doing so would kind of keep your attention busy elsewhere most of the time, and you couldn't cast another spell if that one turns out to be inappropriate. You just have to lose it, basically. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is that the triggering mechanism for a spell is not actually the spell itself, but a separate step, which just normally happens to be built into the spell in most cases. But it's important to recognize that it's a discrete action in and of itself. So, with all this, we now know that even in fantasy, even in myth, even in actual religions which practice magic in reality, or at least believe they do, there's still a scientific basis behind all of it. Magic is not, interestingly enough, magic. You can actually understand how it works. In terms of how magic works in fiction, the more you study it, the more it actually seems to work suspiciously similar to electricity. Mana, or any other energy source for your magic, regardless of what you call it, is essentially the carrier particle for magic, just as photons and electrons carry electricity, gravitons carry gravity, and bosons, mesons, and gluons handle the nuclear forces. In this case, mana is not a generic source of energy, but rather an actual particle which can be exchanged back and forth. You can have metals infused with mana particles, which suddenly means things like how cold iron supposedly works now makes sense. It's simply iron with a positive mana charge, which causes it to negate the negative mana charge of most forms of magic by prying away free mana particles. This explains so much in a consistent manner, from magical spells to enchantments to magically enhanced creatures to things like mithril and orichalcum. Everything just kind of falls into place with a reliable predictability of sorts. Yeah, it's complex and has many facets of how it works, but by treating magic as a fundamental force of nature, it actually ties together all the other forms of magic in every book, every myth, every video game, and every other source you can think of. Magic is a force of nature, literally speaking. This grand, unified theory of magic allows for every concept of magic which has ever been made up to coexist within the same setting. Some forms may be incompatible with others more or less, much in the way of an alternating current and direct current don't play nicely together without an intermediate point of conversion between the two, but they're technically the same thing. And with this concept, things like ley lines also make perfect sense. All they are in this theory is a location where the natural resistance values are either low or non-existent. Meaning, you could quite literally build a magical superconductor. But anyway, that's magic, and magic works on a broad scale. It's big, it's kind of clunky, and you need an awful lot of energy to do even relatively simple tasks with magic. That being said, magical energy tends to be quite abundant in most settings. Even the settings where magic is really scarce, there's still actually quite a lot of it around when you think about it. It's just not in a usable format most of the time. You need to do something to be able to put the magical energy to work for you. Namely, a focus, a spell, and a trigger. And these may not be especially refined to performing magic on a regular basis. It doesn't mean there isn't high background levels of mana, just that it's difficult to access it most of the time. Psionics, on the other hand, work on a vastly smaller scale, with very small bits of energy to create a cascading effect, or like rolling a snowball down a hill, where the hill is the other natural forces. Magic tends to do most of the work on its own. Psionics just acts as the initial spark. We'll get into that next time, though, when we cover psionics, because it works similar to magic in some ways, but vastly different in others. If you want a hint on such, though, we can pretty clearly define the alchemy, as portrayed in Fullmetal Alchemist, as actually being psionics, not magic. Or more specifically, that the human characters in the show and manga are technically using magic, but indirectly. They're using psionics to trigger a magical effect. Sound weird? Well, you've got a few weeks to think about it before I explain it myself. Unless you're watching this in the future after I've already posted the psionics episode. In which case, I guess you can just go click that. Whatever. Oh yeah! And one last thing. Homework. Lagarst. We'll be covering magic in a lot more detail later on in the Playing Goddess series, but for now, your homework is to get the basics out of the way. Figure out what the energy source of your magic is, and what viable methods of focusing that energy into a specific spot are available. Once you have an idea of what your energy source is, and how to get it gathered into one location for use, then consider what kind of methodology for using that energy source would likely arise. We'll get into the traditions and spheres of magic later on, so the specifics aren't too important at the moment. Just get thinking about where this would logically go is all. And with that, I'm out. I'll see you next time.